this theatre with these people, and that they really feel books and writing and stories in their heart, and it's worth travelling the whole world for. So it was worth the long trip, and I'm just glad to be part of the festival at all.
I think people has a lot of sensitivity, so they are very welcoming, and it's lovely because you see an audience who has very good questions. They have a sense of the value of literature and the importance for the city of literature being part of the DNA. So it's beautiful to see the empathy of the people, the welcoming sensation, and the beauty of the city. This is a beautiful city. So I love this place, and I love the way the event is organized in a way that there is many different writers interacting, there is translators, and there is a group of readers who are here, and they are enjoying the value of literature. So it's very, very nice, sensational.
Then I sent a text message to my literary agent. She knows the whole world. I asked her, I said, have you been to 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐿? She said, no. I said, you should definitely come and see how things are beautifully organized. I think that reader's part is so important. We have to give them more space to engage with writers. And then I'm sure we will see some positive outcome in that improved relationship between writer and reader. This is one of few festivals that impressed me.
Mă simt foarte bine la FILIT de fiecare dată. Este un mare festival, fără îndoială, cu o mare atmosferă. Oamenii sunt extraordinari, publicul și participanții se molipsesc de entuziasmul acesta al organizatorilor. Și asta mi se pare un câștig formidabil. FILIT este o ființă, după părerea mea, este o ființă miraculoasă, și îi doresc viață lungă, cum dorești unei ființe vegetale sau naturale sau supranaturale, îi doresc viață lungă și să existe mai departe în peisajul nostru cultural și național.
Mi se pare peste ce era acum 5 ani, dar, repet, e o impresie și impresiile sunt fatalmente subiective. N-am cuvinte să elogiez munca tuturor celor din FILIT și dumneavoastră și toată armata de voluntari. Sunt niște oameni împătimiți și care fac lucrul ăsta, se vede că îl fac cu bucurie și cu risipire, cu cheltuire pentru alții.
Un día aquí y siento que he aprendido lo que podría haber aprendido en 2 años. Me siento impresionada por los lectores jóvenes, por la pasión que hay por la literatura, por la curiosidad intelectual que hay, aparte de que la ciudad es hermosísima. Ha sido de verdad qué bien que estoy aquí, qué bien que he tenido la suerte de participar en este festival.
Pour moi, c'était une soirée de grande qualité. Qualité des questions, qualité de l'écoute, qualité de l'attention. Je me sentais tout à fait porté à dire l'essentiel. Vous savez, quand on sent de l'hostilité, on est prudent. Quand on sent une vraie écoute, on se donne, on se livre.
Beautiful, and I think if there was not a festival like this, I would never come here. I mean, I would never discover what 𝐓𝐡𝐞 is about.
I was coming here imagining that I'm going to the very prestigious but quite small festival. I didn't expect that this is such a good, well-organized European festival, and I'm going to recommend to all of my friends from another countries.
FILIT festival is globally one of the best organized festivals I ever attended. I feel so warmly welcomed here, and I have had great discussions with the translators and with the press and with the interviews, and people really feel that I have a feeling that people really care about books.
Găsit, doamnelor și domnilor, bună seara! Bine ați venit la cea de-a patra seară FILIT, aici la Teatrul Național Vasile Alexandri din Iași. Am avut o seară foarte bună ieri cu domnul Abul Gurnah, o seară foarte bună cu Cătălin Ștefănescu. Despre asta este dezbaterea FILIT, dezbaterile FILIT, un spectacol viu al literaturii. Ca o informație din culise, aș vrea să vă spun că domnul Gurnah a vrut să-și anuleze biletul de avion atunci când a auzit pe cine avem noi invitat în această seară. Din nefericire pentru el, când ai de-a face cu agenții literari, e imposibil, mai ales când ai luat premiul Nobel. Noi, din fericire, nu avem premiul Nobel, așa că o să ne bucurăm în această seară de invitatul nostru. Colm Tóibín. Așa se pronunțați numele acestui mare romancier, poet, dramaturg, jurnalist și critic literar irlandez, tradus în peste 30 de limbi. Un domn care spunea, propozițiile pe care le scriu își au rădăcinile în cântec și poezie și își au reperele în muzică și pictură. La fel de mult ca și nevoia de a transmite o simplă informație sau de a oglindi ceva. Nu sunt un scriitor realist, chiar dacă par a fi unul. Bună seara, mă bucur că sunteți din nou aici, mă bucur că sunteți un public minunat pentru seriile FILIT și nu numai. Bună seara, bine ați venit! Colm Tóibín, născut pe 30 mai 1955 la Enniscorthy, în comitetul Wexford. Colm Tóibín e un romancier, poet, dramaturg, jurnalist și critic literar irlandez, ale cărui cărți sunt traduse în peste 30 de limbi. A studiat la University College din Dublin, iar între 1975-78 a trăit la Barcelona. Este autorul a 10 romane, Primul, 𝐓𝐡𝐞 1990, inspirat de experiența spaniolă, a fost distins cu 𝐓𝐡𝐞 Literature Award. Următoarele au revelat un mare scriitor european, fiindu-le acordate numeroase premii. Brooklyn, apărut în 2009, tradus în românește la Humanitas Fiction anul acesta de Cristina Nicolae, a câștigat Costa Noel Award și a fost ecranizat în 2015. Casa Numelor, 2017, traducere de Mihnea Gafița, apărut în 2023 la Humanitas Fiction, și Magicianul, 2021, tradus de același Mihnea Gafița la Humanitas Fiction în 2022, pentru care s-a documentat, atenție, 15 ani. A primit în 2022 Rathbones Folio Prize, fiind finalist la Prix Femina Étranger și Prix Medicis Étranger. În 2022 a apărut și prima culegere de poezii Vinegar Hill, iar în 2023 volumul de eseuri A Guest at the Feast, Long Island. E continuarea romanului Brooklyn, care va fi publicat până la sfârșitul acestui an, 2024. Tóibín a semnat și volume de proză scurtă și critică literară. El publică regulat în periodice culturale importante și este deseori visiting professor la universități importante. Vă mai spun că în 2021 i s-a decernat David Cohen Prize pentru literatură pentru întreaga sa operă. Actualmente este profesor la Columbia University și cancelar al Liverpool University. O parte dintre însemnările sale personale și arhiva sa de lucru se află în custodia Bibliotecii Naționale a Irlandei. Înțelegeți de ce domnul Gurnah voia să rămână la Iași pentru această seară FILIT. FILIT este organizat de Muzeul Național al Literaturii Române Iași și Consiliul Județean Iași, principal finanțator. Mulțumim! Ediția de anul acesta este finanțată și de Ministerul Culturii și se desfășoară sub înaltul patronaj al reprezentanței Comisiei Europene în România și sub patronajul Comisiei Naționale a României pentru UNESCO. De asemenea, FILIT 2024 se subscrie programului UNESCO Iași, oraș al literaturii. FILIT 2024 se bucură de sprijinul Primăriei Municipiului Iași. Mulțumim, Primăria Municipiului Iași! Mulțumim pentru sprijin și Inspectoratului Școlar Județean Iași, Asociației Patrimoniu pentru Comunitate, Cărturești, Palas, Aqua Carpatica, Mob Expert, cu aceste canapele, care mie îmi fac cu ochiul la ora asta, Volvo Premiul Nordic Cars, partenerul nostru de mobilitate. E o nebunie să plimbi toți scriitorii aceștia într-un oraș aglomerat la FILIT și de asta trebuie să le mulțumim. Și Domeniile Sâmburești, un alt partener important. Și Simigeria Petru este cea care ne susține. Le mulțumim și am să vă rog să-i aplaudați. Mulțumesc! Partenerul de ospitalitate, Hotelul Nira, iar cafeaua festivalului Noir. Partener, Institutul Francez, care anul acesta își sărbătorește centenarul, Centrul Cultural German Iași, 𝐓𝐡𝐞, Palatul Copiilor Iași, Universitatea Alexandru Ioan Cuza din Iași, Librarium, Netherlands Letterfonds, Asociația Traducătorilor Literari din Norvegia, Norsk Oversetterforening, Memorialul Ipotești, Centrul Național de Studii Mihai Eminescu, Biblioteca Județeană Gheorghe Asachi Iași, Pro Helveția, Norla, Tudor Personal Tailor. Partenerii locali, foarte importanți, acel badge verzuliu de un verde crud și foarte frumos pe care îl vedeți la gâtul invitaților, înseamnă o reducere de 10-15%. Nu e mare lucru, dar contează foarte mult când ești într-un oraș străin să fii regalat cu o reducere. Nu e așa? De asta trebuie să le mulțumim partenerilor noștri și să mulțumim și lui Dumnezeu că sunt foarte mulți de la an la an. Așadar, Acaju, August Number 2, Birzon, Bindu, Bistro la noi, Briz, Bonvino, Capra noastră, Cafeneaua noastră, Cafeneaua veche, Caferamica, Șezami, Cuib, Farcowork, Fica, Flersent, Frateria, Fumbai Nemțeana, Gist, Huna, Indus, Yasiro, Leaf Coffee, Maison du Café, Manifest Pub, Navar Coffee, Negruzi, Nourora, Panere, Retro Cafe, Șotărie, Teus Cafe, The Beginning, The Trumpets, Traz și Nu, Liceul Varlam și Iași Travel. Vă mulțumesc! Anul viitor o să port ochelari și o să fie totul mult mai bine. Mulțumesc frumos! Fac efortul, dar e cam degeaba, nu mai. E deja vârsta la care trebuie să iau cu mine. Editurile partenere, Polirom, Humanitas, Humanitas Fiction, Humanitas Junior, Cartier, Arthur, Anansi, Black Button Books, Curtea Veche, Casa Cărții de Știință, Nemira, Editura 3, Editura Tracus Arte, Fides, Acon, DPH, Didactica Publishing House, Univers, Veland, Chiralina și La Două Bufnițe. Partenerii media, Ziarul de Iași, Observator Cultural, Press Hub, Radio România Cultural, Radio România Iași, Suplimentul de Cultură, Viva FM, TVR Iași, Revista Golan, Review de Deux Mondes, Matca, Wink Public Media, Reading is School, Radio Hit, RSS Reloaded și Clubul Logos. Interpretariatul la FILIT 2024 este asigurat de Excelenția. Mulțumim Centrul Excelenția pentru orele, zecile de ore de interpretariat din cadrul FILIT 2024. E foarte, foarte important. Transmisiunea live pe Facebook a serilor FILIT și nu numai este asigurată de 4B Media. Am uitat în fiecare seară de ei, datorită lor, cei care nu sunt aici la Teatrul Național pot vedea seriile și dezbaterile FILIT. Traducerea consecutivă în această seară e asigurată de Dana Bădulescu și Sorina Chiper, pe care le salut. Ați primit, sper, căști la intrare, cei care au nevoie de ele. Avem sistemul acesta cu căști pentru această seară. Iar gazda acestei serii este vechiul nostru prieten Marius Chivu. Marius e scriitor, editor și traducător, a debutat în 2012 cu volumul de poezie Vântureasa de plastic și autorul la 3 jurnale de călătorie, 3 săptămâni în Himalaya, Humanitas 2012-2016, 3 săptămâni în Anzi, Humanitas 2016 și 3 săptămâni în Atlas, Humanitas 2023. În afară că s-a plimbat, are și o carte de interviuri literare Ce a vrut să spună autorul la Polirom în 2013 și volumul de proză scurtă Sfârșit de sezon, Polirom 2014, reeditat în 2022. Anul acesta a coordonat volumul colectiv Cartea Depresiilor, 24 de confesiuni despre tristețe, teamă, disperare și alți demoni, 2024. Din 2011, împreună cu Florin Iaru, ține cel mai longeviv atelier de scriere creativă din România. Este redactor, bineînțeles, la revista Dilema, realizatorul talk show-ului cu scriitori All You Can Read, e un radio talk show, de fapt, de pe urbansunset.com și comoderator al podcastului Cronicar Digital. Din 2020 este editorul antologiei anuale de proză scurtă 𝐓𝐡𝐞, apărută tot la Polirom. Doamnelor și domnilor, Colm Tóibín, bucurați-vă de spectacolul literaturii vii. O seară bună vă doresc!
Hello.
Bună seara.
Hello. How do you like the chandelier? It's all
Cum îți
beautiful.
place candelabrul? E minunat.
Dear Colm, you're
Dragă
such an
Colm,
accomplished writer. I feel like
Ești un
crying.
scriitor atât de desăvârșit încât îmi vine să plâng.
You wrote thousands of pieces
Ai
of
scris
non-fictional
de
articles and literary essays.
articole,
You wrote
eseuri
poetry,
literare, ai scris
a drama
poezie,
play.
o piesă de teatru.
You are the author of a co-author of a script of
Ești
a movie.
coautorul
You have 2 volumes of
scenografiei.
short stories, a dozen of
Ai 2
novels.
volume de povestiri.
All of them are at least
foarte
shortlisted.
multe
Most of them
romane.
are awarded,
Majoritatea
widely
dintre ele
translated.
au
You travel
fost
all over
selectate
the
pentru
world
proiecte literare,
for
sunt
literary
traduse peste tot
festivals.
în lume, au fost
You were
prezentate la
born in
festivaluri
Ireland.
literare.
You
Te-ai
lived for
născut în
a couple
Irlanda,
of years in
câțiva ani
Spain.
ai locuit în
Now
Spania,
you live to
iar
California,
acum
but then you go
ai
back
plecat în
to Ireland where
California,
you have
dar te
a house
întorci
that you
în
built on your
Irlanda,
own.
unde ai o casă pe care ai
In order
construit-o tu
to
însuți.
have a continuity
Pentru a avea o
with the conversation that
continuitate
Mr. Gurnah had
cu conversația pe care am ascultat-o aseară cu domnul Gurnah, aș dori să încep conversația noastră întrebând unde este pentru tine acasă și câte case ai.
I mean, I think when you get to my age, home is often where you have the books, maybe the CDs, but it's important not to think too much about that concept of home, because it brings with it other concepts like identity or nation. But Ireland is a strange country in the sense that there was not a great displacement at the time of the First World War or the time of the Second World War, so that my grandparents were born in the same town as my parents were born, the same town that I was born in, so that there is a sense all the time of continuity. So I suppose this town called 𝐓𝐡𝐞 in the southeast of Ireland is home. But yeah, I suppose that's true. But really, also, home sometimes is where your head is. I know that sounds silly. Home is where your head is.
And you have your head with you, I guess.
Și acum ți-ai adus și capul cu
There's a
tine.
back part to it as well.
Dear Colm,
Dragă Colm,
as I said, you have
după cum am
a
spus,
dozen of novels.
ai scris vreo
6 of
12
them
nove
translated
de
in
romane, 6 dintre
Romanian.
ele au fost traduse deja în
The
limba
Story of the
română.
Night, Testament of Mary, The Master, The
Povestea
Magician,
nopții,
House of
Testamentul
Names,
Mariei,
Brooklyn,
Magicianul,
and
Casa
Long
numelor,
Island is about to
Brooklyn și
to
Long
get on the
Island
bookshelves of the
urmează să
bookshops
apară
all over
curând
Romania
pe
soon.
rafturile librăriilor.
But there is one theme that
Dar
connects
este o temă care
almost
unește
everything
aproape
you ever create, and
tot
that
ce ai
theme
creat până acum,
is
iar
family.
această temă este familia.
Even there's a novel about a normal family or a biblical
Fie că
family
vorbim de un roman
or a
despre o
Greek
familie normală sau
legendary
despre o
family
familie din Biblie
or
sau despre o
a
familie
famous
legendară
family. And,
din Grecia sau despre o familie vestită.
Let me start as Oprah did with the childhood and ask you, you had a rather tough childhood, but at the end it paid really off for your literature. And I want to ask you, how was for a young boy in Ireland to be sent to a boarding school and to be away from his parents? His father was quite ill at that time. What kind of childhood did you have, and in which way you drew your inspiration from your books from that period of time?
We lived in a small house in the town. My mother had two younger sisters that lived very near, and they didn't marry until later. So they were always in the house. My father had a sister who never married, and she was in the house. Sometimes she came every day at some point. So that you're brought up, it's like being in the 19th century almost. You're brought up in a much wider family than just the nuclear one. And of course, they paid an enormous attention to the small matter of literacy, of study, of school, of you must study, you must do exams. And I was this dreamy boy. I mean, all of the others were really good at everything, my brothers and sisters. But I was dreamy, and I could only do some things, but not others. But, you know, the strange, my father died when I was 12, but he became ill when I was 8. So it was always that shadow. And what's strange about writing is that you think you're inventing something. You think you're involved in, you know, the creation of a character who isn't you. But I find it very difficult to write about a father and a mother continuing their lives with their children. There's always disruption, a break, something happens, someone dies, someone goes away. So that idea of disruption is always there. I mean, this is a small, I mean, there was a moment where at Christmas, we would manage to make a table for maybe 15, 20 people, all of whom were family. And then every year there were fewer. Sometimes there were new children, but more than anything there was death. And that really affects you when my mother, her two sisters, my father's sister, died in the same decade. So that decade became for me a decade where I tried, for example, in a novel like Brooklyn, to imagine one of my aunts and imagine the life she might have lived. But so that all that family, it comes in your dreams, and then it comes in your novels, and you realize that that's actually one of the subjects that really matters. The fact that when I was, you know, when I was a kid, I had all these aunts who were in the house, and they were always talking. And all that conversation got into my ear.
But that didn't stop you to being unable to read by the age of 9. How was that? It's strange.
Yeah, but you see, you didn't really need to read because my sister would read things for me. But also, it was a lovely time before child psychiatry. So they didn't know that there was someone they should send me to for examination. So they just left me alone, saying, "Colm, he doesn't read." But often my mother didn't notice. I'd pretend I was reading. You know, I'd have a book and I'd be nodding in the way readers do, but I couldn't read.
Do you still do it?
There was a famous man at home who couldn't read, but he made an awful mistake. He had the newspaper upside down. So everybody realized, look at him, he really can't read.
So your father was a teacher. What he was teaching about?
Oh, it was a time when all that was general. He taught about 5 subjects. So it wasn't a specialized thing. Yeah.
So is that good? He was that good?
Yeah, people liked him, you know, yeah.
The relationship with your mother, how that changed over the years? Because if I'm thinking about Nora Webster, a novel that hasn't been translated so far in Romania, it seems that that's some sort of eulogy to your mother, but that was really late in your biography.
My mother left school when she was 14. And like a lot of people who left school like that and educated themselves, she was crazy about books. She just thought books were the most important thing in the world, and reading poetry and reading anything. And so later, I remembered that I was in the house with her after my father died. So my father dies, and I'm there then, and my brother, I'm 12, he's 8, and she's in her 40s. And for 3 years, the three of us are there together. And what's really strange, and I think anyone who's been through this experience knows, we didn't talk about my father. At the beginning, maybe the first 2 or 3 days after he died, but then a sort of poisonous silence, that you wouldn't mention his name, and there were no photographs of him. So it was not merely that he died, but he'd also disappeared or been erased, and visitors would call, and you realize they're watching us carefully. Are we all right? Is everything okay? But they're talking about everything except what's important. And that idea, if you're a novelist, you see, is that you can show that. I can show what you're thinking, then I can show what you're saying, and I can show the great distance sometimes between those two things. I think I learned that, in that house, in those years, that I learned about what silence is. Silence is not an absence of sound. Silence is sound or conversation or noise or dialogue where the most important thing is not mentioned. So I certainly lived with that.
So if everybody's saying that there's a great deal of silence in your novels, do you write that silence from the beginning, or you just go back and do the shutting?
Look, this idea that a novel is something that you write notes for and you draft and you write another draft and then, that's all rubbish. I mean, you write a novel, so you write as though you will never get another chance. So you go into a room and you tell the story or you write the novel. I write in longhand, I write with a pen. I mean, I just get this and some paper, it's easy. You don't need a symphony orchestra. And, you write your novel. Now later you can add some things, delete some things, change some things. But the novel must stay from the beginning like it is. And you work, obviously, from your own obsessions. And no matter, so that one of the obsessions is that idea of silence. I think it comes in 2 ways. First one, what I said, that often someone is talking and talking and talking, and you realize they're not saying what they're thinking about. And the second one is, if you want to make a character in a novel, just say you want to create a character, what do? Well, the character should speak, maybe, but the most important thing is you give the character time alone. So you have the character in a room. The character, for example, if there's a party or a dance, or they're going to the pub or the bar, it's the next day that's more important, when everything is remembered, when there's a sense of solitude, there's a sense of the interior life. You need to give that to a character so you can see the character alone, because it's alone when we don't perform. When we're together, we tend to leave silence, add conversation, perform, try to use conversation for many purposes. But when you're alone, maybe there's an intensity around your personality that, again, because you're alone, only the novelist can see you. I mean, God obviously can see you. God is looking down, but the novelist is not looking down. The novelist is looking in the window. And that can be very powerful.
You did some openings here, so I have several questions. Maybe the first one would be related to the process of writing, because you have a really funny way of writing. You still handwrite your novels on part of the page in order for you to add some things, but then you have a word processor. What is that?
Oh, I don't know what the word is. I think maybe it's a laptop. That it used to be bigger. It's not quite small. It used to be called a word processor, but now I think it's called a laptop.
That's honestly, how young I am.
Yeah. No, honestly, word processor is the same as a computer. You really are young, God.
Thank you. Speaking of characters, because you have this novel, Brooklyn, your biggest commercial success. The book has been adapted for screen by one of your fellow Irish writers, 𝐓𝐞 𝐿. And 15 years later, you did a sequel. Long Island, who's about to be published, as I said, in Romanian. Of course, everybody asks you how do you decide to write a sequel? But to me, it was quite obvious that the ending of the novel needed a sequel. It's not a good ending for a novel. It's a good ending for a short story. So I always thought, I mean, at the beginning when I read the book, I always thought this is just the first part. And you left the character, Alice, right? And I always wondered if you don't get attached too much of a character in order that to go back, to continue writing his life years later. Alice is quite young, so there's time for her and for you to get to write another part of the life that she had. So what was what drove you to write the sequel, and what was the hardest part to do it? Because Alice was at a different age, you were at a different age.
Okay, I'm against sequels. You know, I think sequels are bad, generally, and wrong. I mean, think of Gladiator 5. You know, who cares? And also imagine the novels you love. Think of Madame Bovary. And if there's a second sequel called Monsieur Bovary. Think of Moby Dick. If his brother, John Dick. You know, I mean, it's an awful idea. Think of James Joyce Ulysses, A Second Day. I mean, so that's the first thing. The second thing is that in the 1870s in English, the 1870s, a big argument began between two novelists about how to end a novel. George Eliot, her novel Middlemarch, ended the novel by telling you in a sort of afterword what happened to all of the characters of the novel over the next 30, 40 years. So everything was explained, everything was completed. And in a way it was satisfying, but in a way also the mystery was missing. Suddenly, if you knew so much, then you put the book down thinking, well, that's complete. Henry James, about 8 years later, wrote a novel called The Portrait of a Lady. And at the end of that book, he has his character going back to her husband, having left her husband. And as the reader, you think, hold on. No, she didn't. And you read it again, no, she did. And then you turn the page, and there's nothing. The book is finished, and you think, but what happened when she went back to her husband? And Henry James would say, well, imagine. Imagine. Because, in a way, a novel is not a line. And a novel is not a circle. A novel is an arc. It goes up and then down. And you work towards the ending to see if there's a way you could end with mystery, with a moment where something happens, but it's not complete. It's an image. It's not a piece of information. Now, this is a very delicate process. And the problem is that readers become very unhappy because they want to know when she went back to America, like, what happened? So, well, imagine. But I never imagined a sequel. And then 14 years went by, and I began an idea came into my mind for something that might happen to her 20 years later, not as a continuation of this novel, but as a new event. But nonetheless, the characters were the same. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, which was like a dream time, I started the thing that as I explained, that I despise, that I don't like, the sequel. That my beginning of my pandemic, I didn't get COVID. I got the sequel.
For those who didn't read the novel, it's a story of a young Irish woman who immigrates to States, and then she met this Italian young boy, Tony. She has to go back to Ireland, where we don't say more. But I always thought, how cruel for you to leave Tony, the Italian guy, alone in the States for 15 years. Don't you care about your characters?
No. Oh, right, I see what you mean. Before I started the book, I was writing another novel. And I was using a tiny little detail because I was just, the book that you mentioned it's called Nora Webster, and it's the novel about my mother. It's the closest I've written to autobiography or fact, but it's not about me, it's about my mother and those years after my father died. And in about page 3 of the novel, there's a little detail where a woman comes to visit the house, just an ordinary visitor, and starts to talk about her daughter. This is 1967. Her daughter went to Brooklyn, not America, not Manhattan, Brooklyn. And this happened. This woman is talking about her daughter. Now, in that house, my house, often the most interesting thing was if somebody left, if a visitor left, and they could start talking about the visitor. And it was sort of, I suppose, gossip, really, but the gossip was lovely. And someone said that woman's daughter, when she came back to Ireland, she had already married in America, but she didn't tell her family, because that would mean that they would know immediately she was always going to go to America. So that story was told in 1967 in my house, and I remembered it. And 40 years later, never let a child hear anything. Because 40 years later, suddenly it's there in the mind. And it was in my mind because I went for 3 months to Texas. I don't know if anyone's been in Texas, but it's hard. Texas is hard. And I was homesick. And I was teaching in the university, but I woke in the morning, I felt I wanted Irish bread. I don't like Irish bread, you know. I don't like Irish food. Irish food, like it's not famous. It's not like Italian food. But I felt homesick for Irish news. Don't like, you know, for Irish bread. I don't like Irish news on the radio, you know. All those things that you never think about when you're home, like Irish news or Irish bread. It suddenly became, I wanted them. And so when I went home, finally, I wrote Brooklyn, because I had the feeling about what it's like to go to America on your own. And also I had the story that I remembered from the woman about her daughter. So the book came out, and it came out in America. This is the novel Brooklyn. And I was doing a reading, and then I was signing books. And this woman, I imagined the boy behind her was her son. He was very tall. She was very friendly. And as I was signing the book, she said, in a sort of low voice, I think this book is about my mother. And I said, oh, you know, did your mother marry an Italian? Meaning your mother was Irish. And she said, no, I think it really is literally about my mother. I looked up at her, and her son was looking at me, he was behind her. And I said, what was your mother's name? And she said the name, and I said, oh, that's your mother. Because, of course, that was the daughter of the woman who came to visit. And this was the granddaughter of the woman who came to visit. And she knew the story, too, that her mother, when she married first in America, came back to Ireland, but didn't tell them she was married. And then she said, but you got a lot of things wrong. And I said, I know, I only knew half the story. I didn't know the rest. And she said, well, why did you make him Italian? And I said, well, I had to make him something. And she said, but I said then, I looked at her, what was he? She said, he was an Irish policeman in New York, you know, which is a very common, a lot of policemen in New York are Irish. I said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know. Because it was a novel. But she was very nice. And but then her son, the tall guy behind her, said, I didn't like your book. I said, oh. He said, there's not enough in your book about bars. All the pubs in your town, Enniscorthy, are great. I've been in the town. I love the bars. I said, that's true, there's not enough about the bars. So in the next book, Long Island, the one that's coming out soon, there's a lot of stuff about bars. So.
I might ask you something about the Testament of Virgin Mary. Maybe you've met some of her grand.
Yes.
Dear Colm, there's a great amount of loss and grieving and mourning in most of your novels, actually, and in your short stories as well. And I wonder, when did you discover that grieving has such a potential for literature? If you did that, or how did you manage to write while grieving? I imagine there are many forms of grieving, but what's your take on this recurrent theme of your books?
In Romanian, do you have a word for grieving that's different for grief versus sorrow?
Yes.
You do? Could you just say the word?
Yes.
What's the word grief in Romanian?
Do we have one word that encapsulates everything? That's doliu.
Right. What's the word?
And doliu usually means that you wear something black.
Yes.
But it lacks the nuances that you have in English: grieving, mourning, and there's another word.
I'm talking about being doing a reading, and after the reading, I'm signing a book. But this time, I'm in Australia, and again, the woman is very, very nice. But as she's taking the book, she looks at me, and she becomes slightly aggressive, and says, "Okay, so how many people die in this one?" And I couldn't think what to say, so I said, "Quite a few." But the big change is that in this new novel, the novel Long Island, nobody dies.
Because they're drinking.
Well, no, they're not even. No, they're just in bars. But nobody dies. It's the first novel, and I thought, is there something wrong with me that nobody dies in my book? But I think the question is, again, grief is such a strange thing that it comes like waves. You can't control it. That sometimes you could feel an intense sorrow. You could then feel something much worse. And then for a day, it could be okay. So in a way, again, the novel form allows a character to live in a number of different moods in a single day. It's very hard to do that in a movie. It's very hard to do that in a play. But actually, in a novel, it's made for someone, that idea that no feeling is stable under these pressures. That if someone in the family dies, or if you miss someone, that the feelings come so strange, you can't control them. There's almost no name for them. I mean, you can use words like grief, like mourning, like sorrow, but actually it's stranger and harder to control and harder to define than that. And so in a novel, you can work with that. In other words, that in that novel, for example, in Brooklyn, she really misses home. But you can't do that, she missed home. And then the next chapter begins, she missed home more. And the next chapter is, oh, really bad day, missing home. Like, you just can't do it. But what you can do is, the first time she gets the feeling, it is when letters come from Ireland. This is 1952. And she sees the letters. And she goes to her own room. She's now in Brooklyn. And it's the letters that cause her to feel the pain and to begin to be really upset. But a few weeks later, she's fine. She's going to a dance. You know, she's studying. She's, you know that you've got to be very careful not to, when a character in a novel has a feeling, you've got to be very careful that when the reader turns the page, the character's having another different feeling. Because otherwise it's just boring, grieving, homesick, or happiness is worse. Because happiness is really boring. She was really in love. The next page, even more in love. Deeper, deeper in love. Love forever, love and marriage. But a novel is where she was in love, and then you give her a problem. Then suddenly there's a problem. You know, so you create conflict, you create problems, because you need to create drama. Because the whole purpose of a novel is that there's drama. There's something happening. and the reader needs to turn the page to see, oh. So it's not the oh of, oh, I'm so happy, she's happy. It's, oh, is she going to be okay? And so you spend it's a strange life. You spend most of your time in a room on your own, dreaming up these problems for your characters.
Well, I want to stay more in this area, but change a little bit the books. So you have the Testament of Mary here, translated in Romanian. It's actually a novel in the longest tradition of biblical apocryphal novels, that you are retelling something that they say you can't retell, actually. And it's the story of Mary, now old, an old woman, close to her death, maybe. And she doesn't believe in her son as being the son of a god. And she couldn't understand what the apostles are doing. And I want to ask you if this is your statement as an atheist, or maybe, again, a story about a mother grieving.
No, it's not a statement. You know, in other words, look, it is extraordinary, isn't it, that Mary, the Virgin Mary in Catholicism, or Mary, the mother of Jesus, she really doesn't speak in the New Testament. So all the things that happen, but she doesn't speak.
The New Testament being the sequel of the Old Testament.
Yes, but it's not a good sequel. I mean, if I were, I prefer the New Testament. I prefer the sequel. I find the Old Testament is too boring and too filled with lists of things. But the New Testament is fascinating because it has the story of Lazarus, which of all the stories, how do you say Lazarus in
yes. Lazar.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that Lazarus 1 minute is dead and the next minute is coming up. And it seems, I was reading an old translation of the New Testament. And in the introduction, it said that St. John saw Greek theatre, meaning he saw Medea, he saw Electra, he saw Clytemnestra, he saw Antigone, he saw all of them. Can you imagine? And then he went to write the story of Mary and Lazarus and the crucifixion. Anyway, all this was on my mind. Look, I was getting old and I had nothing to think about. You know, like normally if you're like 25, you've got so many things to worry about, like, you know, dancing and music and going out and stuff. But I was getting older and all these things were on my mind. And it suddenly occurred to me, I have a sentence in an earlier novel where someone's grandmother, she's an old woman, says, "I'm old and I will say what I like." And I love that idea, especially in Ireland, you know, where, okay, we have to wait until an old woman speaks and then we get permission. You know, I'm old and I will say what I like. I love that. And I thought, oh my God, the Virgin Mary is old. Imagine she's really old. And she decides finally, in her own voice, to speak just once. That's why the book is short. Show them how short it is.
Yes, unfortunately.
Just pick it up there.
Yeah.
It's really short because she speaks once. One evening, she decides to tell the story from her side. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And now we have one more testament. And so I realized in a Catholic country like Ireland, you know, funny, nobody thought to censor the book or stop the book or attack the book. Everybody was very nice about it. It's funny, Ireland has really changed. Because if you did that if you did that 30 years ago, 40 years ago, I don't know, people would tell you to, go to England with all that horrible. But now it's become very tolerant and easy, and so I wrote that book.
Yeah. I'm really glad that you mentioned Lazarus, because to me, he's the most fascinating character in the book.
I love Lazarus.
It's extraordinary. I mean, it's. I was about to ask you if this book got you in trouble.
None. In America, yeah, America's always a trouble.
Were you disappointed?
There was, it was on in the theater, and a group of people came up from Pennsylvania on a bus to protest, but they didn't really know what it was. Because I went over and said to them, what's going on here? And they said, there's a blasphemous film being shown in there. But it wasn't a film, like it was a play. But I didn't correct him. I just said, okay. But he didn't know who I was. That was good.
Are you a fan of this kind of biblical apocryphal novels? Because Norman Mailer, I know, wrote that.
No.
Or
no, I'm not.
Saramago and some others.
Oh, Saramago, José Saramago, the Portuguese novel, is a really good novel. It's a really good book. But I suppose in certain countries, Poland, in Spain, in Portugal, and in Ireland, the Virgin Mary has a very special place because she was poor. She was illiterate, and she was helpless, and she became Queen of Heaven. So in some way, as Ireland was having a very bad time with colonialism and history, so too Poland, Mary, the Queen of Heaven, became a special messenger for the nation, not just for the church, but for the nation. Ireland felt a special closeness to Mary. And so in Ireland we have a shrine where Mary appeared in 1879, just as in the Pyrenees, in this rocky part of the Pyrenees in France, she appeared in Lourdes, just as she appeared in Croatia in Medjugorje or in Bosnia-Herzegovina. But this idea that she always appeared in a poor place to poor people, that she represented the poor, and she represented not just the poor, but the possibility that the poor could rise as she did and become glorious. So this idea was absolutely fundamental when I was growing up. You would never, ever pray to Jesus. I never knew anyone who prayed to Jesus. You didn't pray to God, and you didn't certainly never pray to the Holy Ghost. I mean, what would you say? But you prayed to Mary, and you had all the prayers ready. The Salve Regina, Hail Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, hail our life, our sweetness, and our hope. You had the Memorare, remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who implored thy aid or sought thy intercession was left unaided. And you had, of course, the Hail Mary. So you had all these prayers, and you had the iconography. In every church, in every Catholic church, there was the statue of Mary, sometimes as the grieving mother, but also sometimes as the Queen of Heaven. So this was built into my DNA. This is in my, every part of me. So the book became a way of trying to deal with that as an artist. I couldn't make a painting. I couldn't make a song. So I used what I could to give her a voice. But I don't see the book as a blasphemous book, but it is filled with doubt because she had a son. She had a baby. She had a son growing up. And so it's not for her that the sacred is what's important. It is that life itself, the business of love, the business of family. So I wrote the book really to explore all this.
Here as well, we are praying for an extraordinary lady saint, Saint Paraskeva. I will tell you later after having conversation. Do you remember when was the last time when you prayed?
No, I mean, we were always praying because I used to lose things more than I do. You lose your keys. And you pray maybe, but I really haven't done that for a long time. No.
I must take another question regarding writing, because I find it quite fascinating that you said that sometimes you draw inspiration for writing from paintings and classical music. And classical music I understand, but how about the paintings? Because the paintings, sometimes they could be quite abstract. There are several paintings that on the internet you can find when you talk about that in interviews. How a painting inspire your style in terms of styles or in terms of structure? Maybe you can tell us more about that.
You see, I think you're talking here about energy. And a novel needs energy. Now, what's energy? And energy is something in the rhythm, the sentences, the way they're formed. It's something in the structure. It's something in the way things move and change in a novel. It's about slow time, moving. It's about the sentence doing something new. And no matter, if you look at a painting, for example, you look at a Rembrandt, a painting of a woman or of an old man, and you look at all the marks, and you imagine him with the paint, trying to get one more part of the nose. I need a little thing on the nose here. And how much work you have to do to create the illusion that this man's nose is slightly, funny. Just say in a painting, in a Rembrandt painting. Or in a Vermeer painting, that the girl's face is placid. You have to do that with so much work, with the paint, making each stroke different each time. And so you come to writing, and you're attempting to create the illusion for the reader that you are in the room with this novel. It's not just you're reading about other people. You're suddenly thinking you are this person. And that has to be done very slowly, very carefully, trying to make every sentence pull the reader in, not just to the story, but to the character. And so the idea of paint, even more than sculptor, the idea of not just cutting but adding another little mark, adding paint over that mark, that all of that is very inspiring because you can actually start imagining how you can create that illusion, or that you can embed the reader in the mind of another person, which is really a sort of miracle. If you could do it in a novel, it would be a wonderful experience. My own experience as a reader tells me, what's more important than that? Well, I suppose many things, like having a baby or something, or falling in love, or but nonetheless, that idea for any of us who've been through the experience of reading Anna Karenina, say, which we were talking about last night, or just reading any novel in which this miracle happens of you for a second forgetting yourself and thinking you are in the room with one of these people.
It happens to you while reading some other writers' novels that at some point you are so fascinated that you close the book and just stay and think about what you read?
Oh, I think reading is all about, isn't it, stopping for a second, going, it's that sometimes you want to read fast, but sometimes, it's a funny experience sometimes where you want to put the book down. Yeah.
You do the same when you go to museums, just to stare for minutes in front of a painting that you love?
Yeah, but I do that with people as well sometimes, but
You stop people on the street?
Yeah, you want to see someone. But that the idea of, I think the idea of looking carefully and paying attention in every area of life is probably worthwhile.
So you do the same with people, the thing that I saw you when you were staring in the window at the Turkish Delight for hours?
Yeah, there's a shop just around the corner that sells Turkish Delight, but the colors were new to me. It looked like pomegranate or something, Turkish Delight. And I was looking at the yellow, the green. In Ireland, we don't have Turkish Delight, except imported. So I was absolutely, he was really irritated because I was delaying him. I was looking at the window at the Turkish Delight. Of course I was.
But every day. Let's go to the House of Names, from the Turkish to the Greeks. This is another retelling of a story, this time of legendary Greek tragedy of Orestia, through three voices, Clytemnestra, Oreste, and Electra. And I was wondering, how can you engage in writing a novel if you don't have some points of convergence with the characters? And I wonder, what were those points of convergence with such tragic characters?
This time I'm talking about where I'm in my 40s, going into my 50s, and I start working with actresses and actors. For example, there's an audiobook of the Testament of Mary that's done by Meryl Streep. Now you can just imagine, I'm from a small town in Ireland. Like the idea that Meryl Streep is coming to read my book. So it was a big adventure. I only met her briefly. I don't think she even knew who I was, but she did my book on audio. But the big one was Fiona Shaw. People will know Fiona Shaw because she's Aunt Petunia in Harry Potter. You don't. Anyway, she is Aunt Petunia. I don't know. Does this mean anything?
No.
Anyway, she asked me if I would consider writing a version of Clytemnestra, the story of the Oresteia, the story of the murder of Agamemnon. And I looked at it and thought, I'd love to do that. I mean, if she would act it, I would write it. But then I wrote it and she didn't want to act it. So here you have all these pages that I got completely engaged with the voice of Clytemnestra describing how she murdered her husband. I don't know where this comes from. I have no husband. I don't want to murder anyone. I have never, ever held a knife in my hand except when I had a fork in the other hand. And here I am. This means really that these two things, these stories are very powerful, these Greek myths, the story of these women because if you think about it, when did the voices of women come into the world, our world? And of course, in these Greek plays, we have, Medea, Electra, Antigone, etc., meaning that if we didn't have them, we would only have men speaking. And you just think about men, like when men speak, it tends to be boring. And so here we have this excitement in the voices. And that's the first thing. And the second thing is that really we can imagine anything. And I found this, just the shape of the story. The problem then was, there's a big mystery. I'm sure there are professors in the audience who will say, but nobody knows where Orestes, who's the boy in this story, where he went. He's kidnapped or he disappears, and then he comes back. But where was he? So I think there are many conferences held on this matter. Where was Orestes?
Imagine.
Yeah. And so I begin to imagine what happened to him, and I go back to thinking maybe they sent him to an Irish boarding school. Now, I have to be careful. I have to make it, I can't have electricity. I can't have Catholic priests. But I can have the atmosphere of all these boys and all this sort of threat of violence and strange sort of sexual energy. I can put all that into the middle of this book. And that's what I did. And so it's a strange book for me because I was using odd emotions, and I was using voices. But in the middle of the book, it's the nearest I've come to describing what my own life was like when I was about 16 or 17.
Do you find it quite easy to write women voices? I mean, thinking about Virgin Mary or Clytemnestra, Electra, Ailis. There are a lot of female characters in your novels.
Yeah, but I was talking about my family and my mother's sisters and my father's sister and my own sisters. Just say on a Sunday afternoon, when I'm, say, 5, all of these women could be upstairs in my parents' bedroom. And if I can get into the room, I can sit on the floor and listen. And they could be talking about nothing. They could be saying, Auntie Harriet, my aunt, could be talking about a coat that she almost bought in Dublin, but didn't. And they'd all be talking about it, and voices would be coming, and it would be fascinating. In other words, no matter what they spoke about, it was interesting. So then they put me out of the room, the 5-year-old, out, because I'm listening too closely. And they want to talk about things that are secret. I go downstairs, and my father, his brother, his other brother, my own brother, are talking. One of them is smoking. You know that way men smoke? And they're talking about nothing. One man is saying, that goal in football, that goal on Sunday, the second goal, was good. And my uncle could say, I look, what? What? And then my other uncle could say, but the first goal was good as well. And I'm 5, and I think this is the most boring thing. These men are the most boring people I've ever met. And I try and go back upstairs again. So in some way, say, some of these books are ways of using that conversation that I was listening to upstairs and allowing it into a book. But I suppose, yeah, so that's just one reason why these voices are really interesting, because they were there when I was small, and they were always, no matter what would happen, they would say something interesting. Whereas the men were just...
Do you think you're still better with your ears rather than with your eyes? Do you hear more than you see?
I began to notice things. I began to notice, for example, that often if there was a problem, they wouldn't talk about it, that the voices were used to mask and disguise. But yeah, they were just interesting. It was just that you were watching people every week, every day, and you got to know them very well from how they presented themselves to the world. Yeah.
Dear Colm, let's go to...
Oh my God, he's going through all my books one by one.
And we are just at the beginning of the night.
Okay. I'm here.
I must remember you that you can use the QR code up there to write some questions, from which I will select some at the end of the talk. I don't have the master here, I can see that now, but I have the magician. The master is, it's a biographical fictional book about the last 4 years of Henry James, now in his 50s. He's obviously, not just for you, but especially for you, maybe a really important author. And the other one, The Magician, is about Thomas Mann, probably your most spectacular and ambitious book that you ever wrote. You did some quite a research for this one. I read somewhere that you had 40 books about Thomas Mann, biographies, diaries, volume with letters and stuff like that, that you've been working for 15 years to complete the documentation and the writing of this book. And I wonder what made you to engage with such an energy and time writing fictional biographies of these great authors. You're not the only one, but of course, you did your take on them.
I wrote a novel called The Blackwater Lightship, and it has 6 characters over 7 days in Ireland. And the weather is awful, it's raining. So there's a lot of rain, there's a lot of recrimination, there are a lot of Irish people shouting at each other, and everyone's blaming everybody for everything. There's a grandmother, a daughter, a granddaughter, the grandson, and friends, and it's really, really claustrophobic. And I thought, I'll never do that again. I don't want to write any more novels about Ireland, about rain, Catholics, recrimination, families, grandmothers, grandsons. I'm finished. I'm going to write poetry. I'm going to write... And then I realized that I could write a novel about Henry James. Now, Henry James is known for many things, but one of them is he was very grand. He had money. He was born in 1843, and his grandfather was the 2nd richest man in New York State. So this was money, meaning for research for the book, instead of remembering my family or thinking about rain, I could go to Venice. I'm researching my book in Venice. That sounded good. And I'd go to Rome, because he lived in those places. And what I was trying to do was apply the methods I've been talking about of total immersion, of embedding the reader in a room where the character is, if I could do that with somebody from history, meaning Henry James. He died in 1916. One of the reasons I'm interested in him is that there's a great ambiguity around him. For example, he was rich, but he was always worrying about money. He was always calling himself poor. He wrote very well about people who don't have money. So all that money was, you could never be sure, it was a really complex thing. Also, his sexuality was complex, except that he was probably exclusively homosexual. But he was very secretive and very, very careful. This, of course, was England in the, London in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. He was very, very careful. His best friends were all women. He loved his family. He really loved them. And he got away from them as quickly as he could to England. They were in America, and he stayed away from them. So that every time you touched an area of his life, you realize, this is complex. This is not a simple life. This is not just a novelist who wrote novels, and he grew fat, and then he grew bald, and then he died. This is a huge number of unresolved experiences and feelings, and the other thing is, of course, that the number of books about Henry James, it's more than Napoleon almost. You know, it's really extraordinary. It's besides all his novels, we have his brother was a psychologist or a psychologist and a philosopher. So we have all his brother's books. His sister kept a diary. It's always a very bad idea, a diary. His sister kept a diary. There's a biography of his father. There's a biography of the whole family. There's a biography of his two younger brothers. There are many biographies of Henry James and his brother. There's a biography of his sister. There are all the letters Henry James wrote, all the letters his brother wrote, all the letters his sister wrote, and there is also a volume of letters between Henry James and his brother William. Now, this is wonderful, wonderful for me, because every morning I can wake up and instead of thinking about rain, bad food, Irish people, I can say, I wonder what he was doing on the 21st of September, 1897. And I have everything. He didn't keep a diary, but he kept notebooks. So I can go to his notebook. I can go to a letter. And the thing is, I don't have to read all of it. I just have to read a start to see, that's what he was doing that day. And then I can start writing. I can start imagining. I can start seeing him in a room. And so it was really nice work after the horrible business of Irish families. I had a nice, posh man. But when I was finished that, I was unhappy again because I thought, I was brought up in I'm not posh. I mean, look at me, I'm not posh. And I'm not, so I just thought, trying to write a novel about duchesses and grand people and gondoliers and Venice and Rome and transatlantic travel, and stop trying to do that, And so I wrote Brooklyn about an ordinary Irish girl who goes to America looking for work. So in a way, each book, it feels later on, at the time it didn't, a sort of retaliation for the previous one. But certainly our response, certainly the feeling when you finish a book, I'll never do that again. Partly because the levels of emotion you put into the thing are so intense and so just shivering that you just think, please, you pray maybe, but pray to just yourself, say, don't do that again.
But you did with The Magician.
I always give in. I'm weak. I'm a really weak-willed person, and I always give in. Yeah.
Thank you for your weakness, Colm. But even so, The Magician, it's in a way a different book in many, many ways, actually. You did travel a lot documenting the book. You went to Brazil, California, Munich, Princeton, just to see the places where Thomas Mann and his family lived. Because it's a book about family, it's a book about marriages, a lot of characters. Very interesting secondary characters, Katja, for example, Thomas Mann's wife, the boys, Klaus, who was also a writer and eventually who committed suicide. The other one, Golo, who is an extraordinary character, a scientist. And you had this huge amount of information. I wonder how you managed to write a novel with such an amount of information. How did you find the gaps in order for you to fill in with the fiction? And if, again, the unresolved sexuality that interested you as much as the character itself in the second biographical fiction?
Thomas Mann was born in northern Germany in 1875, and he died in Switzerland in 1950. Now, what's really interesting about those dates, they really dictated his fate. Henry James, born in 1843, dies in 1916. Henry James lives in a period of peace. War does not affect him. And Thomas Mann, on the other hand, is, you can just imagine, he's almost 40, and he's been living in a time of peace when the First World War begins. He then, after the war, lives through the Munich Revolution, 1918, 1919. He lives through the inflation, the German inflation, the rise of Hitler, the rise of the Nazis, the Second World War, and then the Cold War. All these things have a deep effect on this non-political man, this man who, if there was no war, would have been quite happy to have stayed at home in his study reading his books. But the question of quite happy, you see, as a novelist, you can never say quite happy. I mean, who's quite happy anyway? And therefore, you look at, oh, he had 6 children. So when he died, he was the most respectable person in 1950. Thomas Mann, German, 3-piece suit, scholarly, serious, brilliant, culture. But he was married with 6 children. So that's very nice, 6 children, except that when his diaries appeared, 20 years after his death, he kept diaries all the time, we realized that he was homosexual. Now, don't ask me, tonight is not the night to discuss how someone homosexual has 6 children. But he had 6 children. And he also had a very odd and interesting marriage. It wasn't as though his wife was permanently unhappy. It was as though Munich in 1905, when they married, she was from a very bohemian family, that the idea of sexuality was so open then, more than it is now maybe. You know, the Freud's ideas were coming from Vienna. These people were bohemian and young. And of course, the idea that for her, that it didn't seem a big problem in 1905 and later on. She wrote her memoirs, and her memoirs, there's an extraordinary passage in these memoirs saying, yes, we went to Venice. Yes, Tommy, she calls her husband, Thomas Mann, Tommy. Yes, Tommy looked at this boy on the beach. Yes, the boy was beautiful. And you realize, Death in Venice, Thomas Mann's story, was based on something that happened in Venice the year before, when he was with his wife. So in the story, Aschenbach, the character is alone, but in life, Thomas Mann was actually with his wife on the beach, and he was staring all the time at this boy. And so I became interested in this idea of a sort of, again, we're talking about the distance between the public person and the private individual. That the idea then in these years, just say in a year like 1900, that this was how great numbers of homosexual people lived, where they had a private life, maybe a private life in their dreams, but maybe a private life in strange ways, but their public life was entirely different. Now, I can work with this. I can work with this for 2 reasons. One, that I myself am homosexual, so I have a sense of being brought up in a very repressive, dark place, which is Catholic Ireland. Say when I was, say, 15, it was 1970. Well, I can tell you the 1960s did not happen in Ireland. Later I read about, okay, we had the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, but they were on the radio. You know, but actually private life was really controlled by politicians. and by the Catholic Church. And I lived in that world. And so I knew about what repression does to the spirit, which is that it really damages you, having to pretend, having to try and obey the rules. And so therefore, I had this already in my mind, that I had lived that life myself as a teenager. But also, what I was talking about earlier, the idea that the novel itself, the form, is very good at that idea of something that's secret, that's hidden, that's unmentioned, that's unmentionable, but yet it's there all the time. And the reader turns the page knowing that when Thomas Mann is getting married, when his friend says to him, "You can't do that. You can't marry this beautiful young girl. Does she know about you?" And Thomas Mann doesn't answer, but the reader, it becomes clear. She almost does. And the novel is very good. The form is very good for what someone almost knows. You can see, oh my God, they almost know, but they won't say it. They won't know it in full, but they have a feeling for it. And my job as a novelist is to create that atmosphere and to embed the reader in it, so the reader is living in this world. And so in both of the novels, Henry James and Thomas Mann are, I suppose, secret homosexuals. But there's something even more important, I think, where I didn't realize this until later. They're both the second sons in a family of 5. So there are 5 children in their families. And they're the second son, and their older brother was really athletic. I am the second son in a family of 5, and my older brother was really athletic. So maybe without knowing, unconsciously, in some strange way, I was trying to find, is there anywhere in literature, in history, in politics, was Napoleon the second son of a family of 5? Was Stalin? No, Stalin's not a good example, but I mean, you know what I mean? Was Charles de Gaulle? Oh, he's the second son. You know, but I don't think so. These 2 men were second sons in a family of 5, and their older brother was really a haunting figure for them, because when they were growing up, he was always outside playing, when they wanted to be inside playing with their mother in the kitchen. And so maybe the novels are sort of secret autobiographies, but I didn't know that when I was writing them.
How shocked were you when you find out in the diary of Thomas Mann that he was looking differently at his own son, Klaus?
Oh, I think that Death in Venice, when we realized that it was really something that happened, because you see, with the film of Death in Venice is much more sexual. The film made by Visconti is much more, you can see the longing, the desire in the eyes of this old man for this young boy. And I think now, just this moment, we just think, no, we don't want a film about that. Thank you. You know, now we are much more intolerant, I think, of that sort of creepy thing. I mean, it is creepy. But
I saw the movie 2 years ago. I didn't see it as...
It's unwatchable.
No.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not the second son of a... No, I just found... I mean, Visconti did the good thing, I think, because the boy is really, in a way, it's non-sexual. It's like an oeuvre. It's like a piece of art, just like Thomas Mann is developing the ideal Greek theory while watching the boy. You don't know if he's watching the boy or just a sculpture.
Yeah. He's playing an interesting game about a theory of beauty, or possibility that this is distant beauty and something much more sexual. But anyway...
But my question was the relationship with Klaus, which is actually a tragic one.
Yeah, that in other words, it might seem simple that this man, who was probably homosexual, had 6 children, but nothing is simple like that. So of course the oldest boy, I think, was the most damaged by the fact that his father was a writer, the son wanted to become a writer, and the son, Klaus, was much more openly homosexual, because in Germany in the 1920s, you could be. And then there's a moment in the diaries, it's really an astonishing moment, and we really don't know what to do with this moment. When Thomas Mann writes in his diaries that by accident he came into a room and he saw his son, Klaus, who was maybe 17, and he saw him naked, and he found him very attractive. Now, my position, my thing is that this happened. Should he have been silent about it? Should he have told nobody? He wrote it in his diaries. And so, I mean, this is a really dangerous territory, isn't it? Isn't it?
Are you asking me?
Yes?
Yes, it is.
And therefore, in writing the novel, I was aware that there were many areas, his sexual dreams, his respectability, his efforts to be more respectable, his writing down his sexual dreams, even when he was worried that his diaries would be read, he wrote more sexual dreams. There's a moment in 1950, Thomas Mann falls in love. He's 75 years old, and he falls in love with a sort of fleshy or fat Bavarian waiter who's working in a Swiss hotel. Now, I mean,
in Dolder Hotel, maybe?
What?
In Dolder Hotel in Zurich?
Yeah.
Carlos Fuentes had this theory that actually Thomas Mann saw the boy that inspired Tadzio in Venice as a young boy playing tennis on the court in front of the Dolder Hotel in Zurich. You've been there, but after you finish the book.
But in any case, his sexual life is really secret and strange, and when it emerges in images, it's even stranger. So I think I tried to enter into his spirit in a novel, so the reader becomes him, and the reader lives in his mind. And again, when it was finished, I said, I'll never do that again.
I guess it's a good sign when a novel you feel exhausted after.
No, I'm not talking about exhausted, which would be just, it is that whatever you've been doing with such levels of intensity that you feel you've used up a huge amount of emotion, and you feel that whatever you've done, you have completed the arc, and that you have finished the book, and you put it aside. But there's something extra that I don't know what it is about it, but I know when I'm finished a book, I go, I don't want to go near that book again.
Anyway, I find really disturbing your conviction that Death in Venice will not be published today if someone will write it. Someone said the same about Kafka, that Kafka wouldn't find an editor these days for his novels, for his. But I want to stay on this topic of sexuality. In 2002, you wrote a quite long essay called Love in Dark Time, Gay Lives from Wilde to Almodovar. And I guess that's the place when you said that Llorca or Bacon or Joyce's sexuality is really clear, and you're more interested in unresolved sexuality, just as Henry James and Thomas Mann did. And I want to ask you the same question. When did you resolve your, how come did you decide to address your homosexuality back in 1993, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it became easier in Ireland to do anything. I mean, it became easier to be a woman. It became easier to be a child. It became easier to have an independent mind. It became easier to speak. It became easier to write. In other words, the censorship laws on books were abolished in about 1967. They continued to censor films. And the censoring of films, I don't know how it was done here, but in Ireland, the censor would just ban some films, like Last Tango in Paris is not for Irish people. But other times he would just use his scissors, literally cut the film, and you could see the cut in the cinema, and everyone would cheer, like cheer in despair, like why can't we see this next scene? But really by the 1980s, Ireland had become a very free place. But the business of being homosexual was that I wasn't alone in this, that you say, some of your friends knew, and then your sister knew, and then your mother said, don't tell your grandmother. So that, again, we're at family gatherings where don't mention Colm, don't mention your boyfriend, like we don't hear about it for Christmas. You can talk about it after Christmas because your grandmother won't be here. So the whole business of everything was compartmentalized. At work, some people knew, but the boss doesn't know. Don't tell the boss that you're queer. Like, he doesn't like queers. Oh my God. And so you spend your life actually very easily in compartments. And you go to London, and of course, everything in London has always been easier. You go to New York, it's easier too. So you sort of move in this world. So when it came to the time for the referendum, which we had...
In 2015.
In 2015, as you say.
We had 3 years later.
Yeah. When we had the referendum on gay marriage, it was really the funniest, sweetest time. It was really funny because there was a man called Leo Varadkar who later became the Prime Minister. And Leo Varadkar is what's called, can you say this in Romanian, a policy wonk. Meaning he cares about policy.
They understood.
Yeah, he's one of those guys who knows about statistics. If your taxation can do this. And he was so serious. And one day he came on the radio in about 2013. So this is maybe 10 or 12 years ago. And in the course of an interview, he's the Minister for Finance. He's Minister for Health. He's an important minister. And we know he's going to become Prime Minister. And he says, well, as a gay man, what? And he just began to talk about himself as gay. Hold on, Leo Varadkar is gay? So I was in New York and someone just called and said, turn on the radio, Irish radio, now, get on the radio, Leo is gay. Leo is gay. And that was a very exciting idea that someone, and then a minister in the other party came, he's an older guy, came on the radio, like in retaliation, and said, oh, I'm gay too. I've been gay all my life. And then this woman came on who was a television presenter, and she said, well, I'm lesbian. I've always been lesbian. And I thought that everyone in Ireland, the bishop, the archbishop, the cardinal, like everyone you knew, your grandmother, the whole country, one by one, was going, yeah, me, and me, and me, and me, me. And I was going to have to say, stop all this. Stop now, all of you. And so the referendum began. And the idea was, if you're gay, don't speak. Just don't speak. For 3 weeks, please shut up. All of you, gay people. Let your mother speak. Let your grandmother speak. And let your mother say to somebody, I was at his brother's wedding. It was lovely. We loved the wedding. Now I can't go to his wedding. Why? And what am I going to say to him? And so we asked our mothers, sisters, grandmothers, but the big problem, which is the problem they're having in America at the moment, is how do you get your father to change his mind? It was the back with the men problem. How do you get a man age 50 to change his mind? And I had tremendous time because I wrote the speeches for some of the ministers, the government. And it was a beautiful speech saying, imagine your daughter, your beautiful daughter, the daughter you love most in the world, comes crying home, and she's 17 or 18, and you say, what's wrong? Did you fail your exams, your boyfriend? What's your problem? She said, no, I'm lesbian, and I'll never be able to live in Ireland, and no one loves me, no one was ever going to love me. And you're her father, and you're in bed at night that night, and you want to say to her, in the morning, it'll be good, it'll be all right for you. And writing those speeches was great. And to try and get a number, just 10% of men, just to come over to the liberals, to our side. And so it was a tremendous moment. It was a referendum. And and then gay people, we could speak again then once we won the election. We told our grandmothers and mothers, and it's all right now. You can go back. We can start speaking again. So, just things in my life in Ireland really did change and made life so much easier for everybody.
We have a common gay friend. Paul Bailey, asked him to ask you a question, and here is his question for you. And I will ask you to...
This is the English novelist Paul Bailey.
According to Rachel Kushner, you advise her to move regally through this world. Is this your equivalent of Michelle Obama's "when they go low, we go high"?
Yeah, I mean, there's an American novelist called Rachel Kushner.
She's translated here with two novels.
And, you know, the whole problem, if you're, say, writing novels now, especially I think if you're a woman or you're gay, is that there's a huge amount of noise being made on the internet, on what's it called, Facebook and, you know, Instagram. And there's also book reviewers. And I said to her one day, don't pay any attention to anyone. Look at you, you're marvelous, you look great, you're super talented. Like, move regally through the world. And I think I would say that to anyone almost now. Like, be very careful not to listen. You know, you have a kid going to school now, and the kid comes home from school saying, they're saying things about me on the internet. And say, no, you move regally through the world, as though somehow you're above all that. I think it's very good advice. I'm very proud I said this.
You can tell.
Yeah.
Because we talk so much about the novels, maybe we can switch to talk something about poetry. I can't remember if I found the information when you started writing poetry. Maybe you were a kid, I don't know. But you published late poetry, and is this connected to an encounter that you had with Louis Gluck, another American author, or is just a myth?
I was 12, and in our house, you were meant to study. You know, you were doing Latin, you were doing biology, physics. You know, I hated all those things. And, but you were meant to every evening go into a room and study. And I wrote poems. I didn't know what to do because was I meant to admit this? I'd written a poem, but I didn't. But the problem was I sent the poems to a magazine for teenage poems, and they published them. And then my uncle saw them in the magazine. There was a lot of trouble, you know, about, are you writing poems? I said, yeah. And so I had to, you know, but then when I was really, by the time I was 20, I realized that I was a bad poet. And in Ireland, you know, I mean, I know we don't like criminals, you know, but we really don't like bad poets. You know, because Ireland has a lot of good poets still. So a bad poet is like, why don't you stop writing? And I had a friend one night in a bar when I was maybe 19 or 20 who said to me, why don't you give it up? Give up what? I'm doing nothing. I said, poetry. And so I just stopped. And I didn't write again for 30 years, for 30 years. I didn't write a poem. I wrote novels, I wrote journalism, I wrote plays. I did everything possible. But always in the back of my head, there was an idea that I wanted to be a poet. I was a poet without a poem. You know? And I had everything except the poem. And then one day, it began again, the poetry. And I worked really hard on it, but it was still no good, really. And there's nothing worse than a bad poet in his 50s. There's an excuse for a bad teenager poet, but no excuse for this. But then I worked harder, and then, yeah, I had an encounter with Louise Gluck, you know, the great American poet, and she said, not writing poetry is really good. Isn't that a wonderful thing to say? Not writing poetry is good, meaning that then out of not writing poetry, you might actually get something. And then the pandemic came. And I mean, for some reason, the pandemic gave me permission. And so, because the days were so long, and there was nothing to do, nowhere to go, and you think that's going to be the same tomorrow. And it's going to be the same the day after that. And so little things became poems. And I would work really hard. And eventually I got what I wanted, which was a book of poetry.
And are they good?
I don't know. Maybe they're okay. But that's not good enough, is it?
Do you have in your pocket?
No.
No?
None.
Well, I guess it's time for us to see the questions from the audience.
Oh my God, what are they going to ask?
Oh, there's none. There are thousands. Oh my God. I'm curious.
There are people waiting.
How does it feel for an author to see his characters come to life on screen?
This is talking about the film of Brooklyn. I was lucky with the film in the sense that the producer, her parents had gone to New Zealand from Ireland in the same year as Eilish in the novel. And so she was living in London, but she had that idea of uprooting, displacement, emigration. The director of the film, John Crowley, was from Ireland living in London. Saoirse Ronan, the actress, was born in America and was now living in London. But her parents were Irish. So that all of us had a story to tell. So it wasn't merely Hollywood getting involved in this. The town of Enniscorthy, where I'm from, hasn't changed much. So therefore the film, much of the film was shot in Enniscorthy. Now the problem became that the cinema closed in the town. So we had to almost build a cinema in the ballroom of the hotel. So we then had 2 nights, 2 showings of the film. The film opens in a street of the town. So I walked those streets when I was a kid. I remembered those streets. I wrote about those streets in a novel. Those streets were also in the screenplay. The director decided to film the story in those streets. We were now watching our own streets in a cinema around the corner from those very streets. And that was a pretty exciting moment when the audience, who are people from the town, realized, hey, that's Court Street, that's so-and-so's house. And of course, all the extras were people from the town. So it was a good experience. It was really rich. But the other thing is, it was nominated for a whole lot of Oscars, for Academy Awards. So this meant that the film people said I could go to Los Angeles, but that's rubbish because there are 2 entrances for the Oscars, one for the stars and the other for the novelist. In other words, they go in with red carpet. They go in with photographers. They go in with excitement. They can meet Charlotte Rampling. But if you're a novelist, your invitation is to the other door, with no red carpet, no carpet at all, no photographers, just a man sort of pushing you in, and then you sit at the back, and you realize you're just nobody. That, in the world of movies, the writer of the novel, go home, you're nobody, and so it was nice for an evening. I wore a big suit, but I was nobody.
There are about 65 questions so far, but there's one that people seem to really like. Is life shaped by our surrenders and resignations rather than our triumphs, as seen in Eilish's journey in Brooklyn?
Oh, you see, I think if you're writing novels, you must never think in general. You must never think, I know something about life, what life is, how life is shaped. You can only say, I know something about this character, what she will do now, how she will live. For example, she has an older sister who I think in the novel, who would triumph, who's a strong person, who would go to New York and would be really successful there. But Eilish in the novel lives in shadow. She's not like that. So I can't answer ever a question that has any generalization in it. I don't know is the answer. But all I can do is I can get a single individual. I can imagine him or her, and I can try and work the structure and texture and tone of a story. But a philosophy, don't ask me about life. Honestly, I don't know anything about life.
There are several questions about your relation with Joyce. Maybe you can tell us something if you're interested in writing a novel, maybe, or you're just a big reader of Joyce's work.
James Joyce was an Irish novelist. He was born in 1882 and died in 1941. And what he did was astonishing, because he wrote a novel. Well, he wrote a novel called Portrait of the Artist as a young man. He wrote a book of stories called Dubliners, and then he wrote a great masterpiece called Ulysses. And in those books, he found that whatever had happened to Irish experience under the English could be brought down to the small matter of language, to the fact that in Ireland, language was performance. In Ireland, in novel Ulysses, all his people are witty and the people you meet in the city. But I think more than anything else, he created a structure for the novel, a new way of working with style. He was a sort of art genius. And what's astonishing is that he published his great novel, Ulysses, in 1922, the same year as Irish independence. So the country becomes independent politically. And this shining masterpiece appears the same year. And it is a great moment, in a way. This little island at the edge of the Atlantic, the Atlantic, becomes the first country that broke from the British Empire, and after a series of revolutions, broke from the British Empire since America. In other words, America was 1775, Ireland was 1922. The first country to break from the empire, and producing one of the great novels of the modern age in the same year. And it's a lovely idea that the country and the book become, foundations for, I suppose, other countries that broke from the empire. For example, all of the African countries. So it makes Ireland matter, which is a lovely idea.
What did Roger Federer have to say about a decent second serve? And maybe you tell the story for the ones that don't know what's about.
I was in Cape Town recently, just a month before the pandemic. So, and there was a sort of, writers were there, and there were some sports people there, and I said, could I meet Roger Federer to someone? And they looked very, okay, if you want to. But then the problem was, what to do? I just wanted to meet him, shake his hand and say, look, I really think you're great. But what do you do when this man comes up to you, Roger Federer, and he is Roger Federer, and he looks at you, and he says, meaning, why did you want to meet me? So I had to think very quickly of a question. What do you ask? What would you ask Roger Federer? So I said to him, no, I wanted to meet you because I wanted to ask you, what do you think about the second serve? Obviously a first serve is designed in tennis, to get an ace. But if you hit that ball out, what now? And he was very sweet, he really was. He said, no, you must hit the ball in. The second serve must go in. A double fault is out. Forget double fault. But if you only design the second serve to hit the ball in, you lose the point. So you have to really concentrate more on the second serve than on the first, because it has to be both in and surprising and good. He said 1 in 3, make it really surprising. 1 in 3, not every 1, 2, after every 2, but 1/3 generally of second serves must be really interesting and new. And then when he said all that, he was very, very polite. I said, thank you very much, and he went away. So that's how I met him. So that's my friend, Roger Federer.
Do you have literary or just guilty pleasures?
Turkish delight.
Are you worried that someday artificial intelligence might write a novel in your style?
This is a great question. Look, about 3 weeks ago, I was in San Francisco. And we came out of a restaurant. I was with a friend who lives in the city. And I was going to get an Uber, car back to my hotel. And he said, no, I'll call a taxi, and the taxi can drop you your hotel and then me where I live. And he did that. And we waited. And the taxi came. And I got into because he was getting into the back seat of the taxi, I got in the front. There was no driver. There was a wheel, there was a steering wheel, and a seat. There was a seat. And I looked, and he said, yeah, I wanted you to see this. This is the new thing. This is a taxi without a driver. And the taxi would close the doors, and the taxi began to take us in a very orderly, very stable, very serious, very safe, absolutely predictable way, moving the traffic really well to my hotel first. I got out, and then, but I was trying to write about this. So the problem was then, what did I say to the driver? So I went on ChatGPT, I went on artificial intelligence, and I keyed in conversation with Polish taxi driver in San Francisco about fentanyl, which is a new very dangerous drug. And ChatGPT gave me the whole conversation. So I took a small bit of the conversation, and I put in the piece I wrote, and I had this conversation with the driver, except there was no driver, and I didn't have a conversation. But I didn't invent a conversation because, of course, I got it from artificial intelligence. So I did put in a while earlier, I asked artificial intelligence to write the first page of a novel by me, and it was good. And there's no point in saying, oh, it didn't have the quintessential. That's rubbish. It did. So what am I going to do? And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to pretend it's not happening, which I'm very good at. I'm going to go, the whole point of writing novels anyway is pretending everything. You pretend that you know the character, but I'm going to sit in a room, and I'm going to continue writing my books, and I'm going to pretend all that trouble is not out there. And, but it's coming towards us. It's just amazing what it can do. And it stole, how it did this is, in other words, how did a bank get money? Someone invested the money. In other words, it can't just a bank have money. The money had to come from somewhere. So all the systems they have used, they stole from us. I'm part of a group of writers. We can prove that the artificial intelligence people stole our grammar, our style, how we write, in order to make what they do. And we can't sue them because they're so big and powerful, and they could move so easy, even to find them, to name them. What company would you sue? What lawyer would you use? What court could you go to? We suddenly discover there's something so big, so powerful. And we know some of those names of those men who are so big and so powerful, but there's nothing you can do. So since there's nothing you can do about the sea, there's no point in pushing the sea back, because the waves will continue to break. The main thing to do is to go into a room and write a poem and pretend there's no such thing as artificial anything. There's only the real, there's not the virtual. And then if you want to go home that night, call a taxi and just relax in the taxi, saying to the driver, hi, I'm sorry you're not there.
Dear Colm, thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for coming to FILIT. We had a great night. I hope you enjoyed as much as we enjoyed you.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.
And Colm will be delighted to sign the books for you. They are waiting for you outside. So thank you again. Good night.